He was just the mechanic, the man who stayed behind the scenes, never touching the sky. But when the storm hit and the rescue team was lost, he was the only one who could save them. Without a word, he pulled on his old flight suit and took to the skies once more. Because sometimes, the quietest soul carries the strongest courage. Before we jump into this incredible journey, let us know where you're watching from. If you're inspired by stories of bravery and second chances, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We've got another unforgettable story lined up for you tomorrow. Don't miss it. Let's get started. It was early morning at Blue Ridge Air Rescue, nestled in the rugged mountain town of Pine Haven. Snowflakes drifted down, dancing in the cold wind that cut through the silent stillness of the day. Inside the hangar, the hum of engines and the clatter of tools echoed as a group of young pilots prepared for another day of rescues. Among them, an older man stood apart. Caleb Carson, in his mid-40s, wore a weathered flannel shirt and boots that had seen better days. His hands were rough from years of work, the kind of hands that had once gripped the controls of a helicopter high in the sky. Now, he stood just inside the open hangar doors, holding a mug of black coffee, watching the others with a quiet, distant look. To the young pilots, Caleb was just the mechanic, the man who kept their machines running smoothly, the one who tightened bolts and checked fuel lines. They didn't know the man he once was, the pilot who had led missions into the toughest terrains, the one who had felt the weight of the sky on his shoulders. Caleb kept his head down, working silently, a shadow of the fearless pilot he used to be. The past had its hold on him, and for now, he was content to stay in the background. But somewhere deep down, he knew that wasn't the end of his story. Years ago, Caleb Carson had been the lead pilot, a trusted figure in Blue Ridge Air Rescue. He had the skill, the nerves, and the courage to face anything the skies threw at him. He could fly through storms, maneuver around jagged mountain peaks, and land in places most pilots wouldn't dare to approach. But that was before everything changed. The memory still haunted him, sharp and clear. He could still feel the weight of the helmet pressing against his head, the sharp, biting wind of altitude cutting through the cracked cockpit window. It had been a routine mission, or so they thought. They flew low, skimming the rugged terrain of the mountains, the sound of their rotors the only noise breaking the stillness of the valley below. But in the blink of an eye, everything shattered. The radio crackled, frantic voices calling out. And then the ambush, sudden and brutal. Bullets shredded the helicopter's fuselage, sparks flying as the impact rattled the entire machine. Caleb fought with everything he had to maintain control, but the chopper was going down. He tried to call out orders to his crew, but the noise of the battle drowned everything out. The tail rotor failed, and the helicopter spun wildly. Caleb gritted his teeth, trying to steady the craft, his heart pounding in his chest. And then, with a violent jolt, they crashed. He remembered the deafening silence that followed the crash. He was the only one who walked away. His crew didn't make it. The wreckage was scattered in the snow, the smell of burning fuel lingering in the air, the last radio call fading into nothingness. It was a scene he would never forget, one that haunted him day and night. When Caleb finally made it back home, he couldn't bring himself to keep the medals they'd given him. They felt like a reminder of failure, a failure he couldn't face. Instead, he packed up and walked away from the sky. He took a job as a mechanic, thinking it would be enough. The machines didn't ask questions. They didn't care about medals or ghosts from the past. They just needed to be fixed. But in the quiet moments, when the hangar was still and the hum of the engines was the only sound, Caleb couldn't escape the memory of that day. It was a scar he carried, and no amount of time or work could heal it. The pain, the guilt, the fear, they all lingered just beneath the surface. And now, as the younger pilots laughed and joked around him, Caleb couldn't help but wonder if he would ever be able to face the sky again. The storm had been building for hours. Outside the hangar, the snow had thickened, swirling in the biting wind that cut through the trees like a blade. The air felt heavier now, charged with the promise of something worse. Caleb stood by one of the helicopters, his hands covered in grease as he tightened a bolt. He didn't need to look outside to know the storm was intensifying. He could feel it in the air, a pressure, a shift that told him this was no ordinary weather. Inside the hangar? The younger pilots were going through their pre-flight checks, joking and teasing each other as they prepared for another day of rescues. They didn't pay much attention to Caleb. He was just the mechanic, the guy who kept their machines running. They didn't know how much that label stung. Caleb didn't want their sympathy or pity. He just wanted to be left to his work, to hide behind the routine. But as the storm raged on outside, he could feel something tugging at him, something he couldn't ignore. Then, the radio crackled. Eagle 3, we're stuck. Visibility's 0. We need immediate evac. The voice of Ethan Blake, the team leader, came through. Tight and strained. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. Ethan was strong, always in control. But this time, the fear in his voice was undeniable. They were trapped. Caleb froze, his hand still on the wrench. He knew exactly what this meant. A rescue mission, a dangerous one. The storm was relentless, and the terrain was treacherous. There was no time to waste. The younger pilots looked around, murmuring to each other. Caleb could hear their whispers, their uncertainty. "Why doesn't Caleb fly anymore?" one of them muttered. "He's the best pilot we've got." But Caleb didn't respond. He couldn't. The pain of the past gripped him again, making it hard to breathe. He had buried his fears for so long, telling himself it didn't matter. He had given up flying. He was fine with being the mechanic, but the truth was, the past wasn't done with him. Not yet. Ava Turner, the youngest of the crew, stepped closer. She was still new, still eager, still believing that anyone could be a hero if they tried hard enough. Her eyes met Caleb's, and for a moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. She didn't have to say anything. Caleb knew what she was asking. She didn't have to ask. He could already feel it, the weight of the decision, heavy as a mountain on his chest. He was the only one left who could fly. But would he? Could he? Or would he stay hidden behind the tools and the engines, too afraid to face the sky again? The storm howled outside, waiting for him to make his choice. Caleb stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the swirling snow outside the hangar doors. The wind howled, sending blasts of icy air through the cracks in the building. He could feel the weight of the storm pressing against him, the familiar unease creeping back into his chest. He'd made a life out of avoiding this very moment, avoiding the sky, avoiding the pain, avoiding the fear that came with the memories of that day. But now, as the radio crackled with the urgency of Ethan's voice, something inside him shifted. The years of silence, of keeping his head down and working on the helicopters instead of flying them, had been a form of escape. He'd convinced himself that he was content with it, that this quiet life of fixing engines and avoiding risk was enough. But standing in that hangar, hearing the distress in Ethan's voice, Caleb realized that the lie he had been telling himself for all these years was crumbling. It wasn't enough. Not anymore. He thought about the last flight, the one that had broken him. The sudden ambush, the roar of gunfire, the deafening crash of the helicopter slamming into the mountain. He thought about the faces of his crew, their voices fading into the static, the cold that settled in his bones as he crawled from the wreckage. They were gone. He was the only one left. And that guilt, that unbearable weight, had kept him grounded for years. But now, it was different. He didn't have to do this alone anymore. Ava's eyes, filled with concern and unspoken hope, reminded him of who he used to be, the pilot who never backed down. The man who put the safety of his crew above all else. She didn't see him as just the mechanic. She saw him for what he truly was, a man who had once soared through the skies, and one who still had the courage to do it again. The fear was still there. He couldn't pretend it wasn't. But now, standing at the edge of the hangar, Caleb realized something he hadn't admitted to himself in years. He was more than the man who had failed. He was the man who could still save them. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the wrench and set it down. He had to do this. For them. For himself. The sky was calling, and it was time to answer. The storm outside howled louder, the winds biting through the mountains like a living beast, but inside the hangar, Caleb felt a sudden calm. The decision had been made. He could feel the weight of it in his chest, heavy but steady. No more hiding, no more running from the past. He wasn't just a mechanic, he was a pilot. And it was time to return to the skies. The old flight suit sat in the corner of the room, waiting. It had been years since Caleb had touched it. But now it felt like destiny. As he reached for the suit, a flood of memories hit him, the rush of adrenaline, the hum of the helicopter's blades cutting through the air, the responsibility of a crew that trusted him with their lives. All of it had been a part of him once. It was a part of him still. Ava stood nearby, her eyes wide, watching him. She had seen him as the mechanic, the man who fixed what was broken, but now she was seeing something else. She saw the man he used to be, the one who was capable of greatness, the one who could fly through the storm and bring his team home. She didn't speak. There was no need. She understood. Caleb didn't need to say anything either. He pulled on the flight suit slowly, each movement deliberate. His hands were steady, even as his heart raced. The cockpit, though long abandoned, called to him in a way he couldn't ignore. He was no longer the man who had run from the sky. He was the man who had to face it, who had to rise above his past, for the sake of those who depended on him. When he stepped out into the storm, the cold bit at his face, but he didn't flinch. He walked with purpose, his boots crunching in the snow, the familiar sound of the world beneath his feet. Ava followed close behind, her breath visible in the icy air. "We'll get you prepped," she said, her voice shaking but determined. Caleb nodded. His eyes locked on the helicopter Eagle 4, the one he had kept ready for this very moment, the one he trusted more than anything else. He climbed into the cockpit, the familiar controls fitting into his hands like they always had. His fingers danced over the buttons, feeling the comforting hum of the engine beneath him. For the first time in years, Caleb felt something stir inside him. Not fear, but a quiet sense of strength. The storm raged around him, but he was calm. He had made peace with his past. Now, he was here to save his crew. "This is Eagle 4, Caleb said into the radio, his voice low but steady, lifting off. And just like that, the helicopter lifted into the storm. Caleb Carson back where he belonged in the sky, where he was never meant to leave. As Caleb's helicopter rose into the swirling storm, the weight of the decision began to settle into his bones. The past was never far from his mind. The faces of his fallen crew, the twisted metal of the wreckage, the haunting sound of their voices fading as the helicopter went down. It was all there, pressing against him like the storm itself. But this time, he didn't let it control him. The chopper's rotors fought against the icy winds, and Caleb's hands gripped the controls with a quiet certainty. His mind was focused, sharp. He wasn't just flying to rescue Ethan and the crew, he was flying to prove something to himself, to reclaim the part of him he had lost. The fear was still there, lurking in the back of his mind. But it no longer ruled him. He had made peace with it, accepted it as part of who he was. It no longer defined him. With each passing minute, the storm seemed to intensify. Snow slammed against the windshield, a blur of white that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The radio crackled with static, and Caleb's pulse quickened. He could feel the old adrenaline rush, the familiar tension that came with being in the cockpit. It was like slipping into a second skin. He glanced at the instruments, double-checking everything. The world outside was chaos, but in here, Caleb was in control. The hum of the engine, the slight vibration of the rotor blades, the soft buzz of the radio, they were all comforting sounds, reminders that he knew what he was doing. He had done this 1,000 times before. He had the skill. He had the experience. For so long, Caleb had been running from this, running from the man he used to be, from the fear that had nearly destroyed him. But now, as he flew deeper into the storm, he realized something. He wasn't just facing the weather. He was facing himself. And for the first time in years, he was winning. The radio crackled again. Ethan's voice came through, tight but clear. "We're losing heat. We're on the edge of a clearing. Can you get to us?" Caleb's jaw clenched, his grip on the controls tightening. He had heard that voice before, calm, collected, but now tinged with urgency. Ethan needed him. He wasn't just flying for redemption anymore. He was flying because it was his duty. His team was depending on him, and Caleb wasn't about to let them down. With every passing second, Caleb felt the weight of the sky above him. But this time, it wasn't a burden. It was a call he was finally ready to answer. Caleb's helicopter roared through the storm, the chopper fighting against the relentless gusts of wind that slapped at the windshield like frozen knives. Snow, thick and blinding, swirled in every direction, threatening to swallow him whole. But Caleb held steady. His grip was firm on the controls. His eyes focused on the faint glimmer of the radio beacon from Ethan's downed team. The storm raged around him, but in the cockpit, it was just him, the machine, and the mission. As he flew deeper into the mountains, the world outside became a swirling mass of white. The visibility had dropped to nearly zero, and Caleb had to trust his instruments more than ever. The cold gnawed at him, the storm battering the helicopter from all sides, but he kept his breath steady. His hands moved with practiced ease, adjusting the throttle, making minute corrections to the pitch, just like he had done 1,000 times before. The old fear tried to creep in, the familiar whispers of doubt, the ghosts of that crash all those years ago. But Caleb refused to let them take hold. He had faced this before. He knew the sound of failure, the taste of defeat. But he also knew something more now, the sound of determination, the taste of resolve. And it was stronger than anything the storm could throw at him. His mind was clear now, focused solely on the task at hand. Every moment felt like a reminder of who he was, not the man who had failed, but the man who had learned, who had survived. As the storm howled around him, Caleb thought of his crew, his team, and the promise he had made long ago to never leave anyone behind. It was a promise he was about to keep. The radio crackled again. Ethan's voice came through, tight with exhaustion but filled with relief. "Eagle 4, do you copy? We've got wounded. Hypothermia's setting in." Caleb's eyes never wavered from the instruments in front of him. He knew what had to be done. The clearing was just ahead, the faint outline of trees barely visible through the whiteout. Caleb adjusted his course, steadying the helicopter as the wind howled. Shaking the frame of the chopper, he could feel every gust, every jolt, but he didn't flinch. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. The clearing came into view, a patch of dark ground against the endless sea of white. Caleb's pulse quickened as he scanned the area, searching for a safe place to land. The wind fought him at every turn, but he fought back, trusting his instincts and his years of experience. His eyes never left the ground as he made his descent, carefully adjusting the throttle, making sure every movement was precise. The skids of the helicopter hit the snow with a jolt that rattled his teeth, but Caleb barely noticed. He kept the rotors spinning, feeling the familiar rhythm, the sound that had once been a lullaby to him. The world outside was a blizzard, but inside the cockpit, he was calm. He had made it. He had found them. The door opened, and Caleb's boots crunched in the snow as he stepped out into the storm. His breath fogged in the frigid air, his heart pounding from the adrenaline, but his resolve was ironclad. He moved quickly, making his way to Ethan and the others huddled near the wreckage. Their faces were pale with cold, their eyes filled with exhaustion. But when they saw Caleb, relief washed over them like a wave. "Caleb," Ethan said, his voice hoarse. "We didn't think anyone would make it." Caleb gave him a simple nod, his expression calm, but his eyes filled with something more, something unspoken, something that had been buried for too long. It wasn't about proving himself anymore. It was about bringing his team home. He was here. He had kept his promise. And in this moment, nothing else mattered. They worked quickly, loading the injured into the chopper, Caleb's hands steady as he helped, guiding them with the quiet confidence that came from years of experience. The wind howled around them, but Caleb remained calm, focused on getting them to safety. When the last of the crew was aboard, Ethan turned to him, his voice filled with gratitude. "You're sure about this?" Caleb nodded once, his gaze firm. "I'm sure. This ends with all of us going home." He climbed back into the cockpit, the warmth of the interior a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. As the helicopter lifted off again, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from avoiding danger, but the kind that comes from knowing you've done everything you could, from knowing that you've given all of yourself to something greater than fear. The storm raged on around him, but Caleb was no longer afraid. He was a man who had faced the darkest parts of himself and emerged stronger. As the helicopter cut through the snowstorm, Caleb's hands were steady, his mind clear, and for the first time in years, the weight of the sky felt like a call he could answer, and he was ready. As Caleb touched down at the base, the storm finally began to let up, the blizzard giving way to the quiet aftermath of survival. The helicopter's engines wound down with a soft whine, and the world outside the cockpit slowly returned to stillness. Inside the helicopter, the crew of Ethan's team was safe, battered, cold, but alive, and Caleb, for the first time in years, felt a sense of peace. He had done it. He had flown again, faced his fears, and brought everyone home. But beyond the storm, beyond the mission. Something deeper had shifted inside Caleb. He had spent so long running from his past, hiding behind the mechanics of the helicopters, afraid to face the sky again. But the truth was, he had never truly lost the ability to soar. He just needed to remember that the power to rise was always within him. Sometimes, the most difficult battles we face are the ones within ourselves, and the only way to move forward is to confront those fears head-on. For Caleb, it was never about proving to others that he could fly again. It was about proving to himself that he was still capable of greatness. The weight of the past was always going to be a part of him, but it no longer had the power to hold him back. Caleb had learned that fear is not something to be avoided. It's something that can be embraced, understood, and used as a tool to fuel growth. In the end, the real lesson Caleb learned was simple: you can't run from your past forever. The only way to heal is to face it, to accept it, and to keep moving forward. And sometimes, it's in those moments of quiet courage, when we don't think we have the strength to go on, that we find the greatest strength of all. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more inspiring tales of courage and resilience, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories, and drop a comment below to share how you face your own challenges. We'd love to hear from you.